Welcome Internet to Psychologist Casual Review, and today we're going to be reviewing Psychodynamic Theories of Schizophrenia Revisited by Dr. Rupani and Dr. De Sousa. So I hope I'm saying those names right. To the extent of my knowledge, Dr. Rupani and Dr. De Sousa are both Indian psychiatrists, and they've published this in the Journal of Mental Health, the Indian Journal of Mental Health, should I be precise. So why I found it important and interesting to talk about this article is that it's not very long, and it's a very, very, very good starting point if you don't know the theories and the psychoanalytic theories on schizophrenia, as there's been a whole range of them throughout both regional and through time, and all of them are interesting, but they're not all very clear. So this is a good start if you ever were interested. But I must stress this: you cannot stop here. Like, it's not the be all and end all of theory. This is like the appetizer to your meal that's gonna come after. But it's giving you a good starting point to know where to choose and where to start. So it presents a whole variety of ways of thinking about schizophrenia and of handling it. So we're going to start with the very basic, the OG of psychoanalysis itself, Freud. So for Freud, the whole point of schizophrenia is that the ego, because of constitutional reasons, is not strong enough to fight off the id. So here we have the model of psychic instances: superego, ego, and id. And in Freud's mind and Freud's theory, the id overwhelms the ego, meaning that the sense of reality is lost because the ego can't fight back enough against the id, cannot control it enough, meaning that the person is losing touch with reality because they're experiencing the pleasure principle at its maximum, and also the anxiety that comes with them at maximum. There's no filter on it, it's just like there in itself. In this idea for Freud, this means that the schizophrenic person, I was going to say the psychotic, but for Freud they're virtually synonymous. The schizophrenic individual is going to be, in a way, lost in primary narcissism, i.e. narcissism that's objectless, meaning that it's all about themselves, so to speak, not in a narcissistic way, but they can't experience the other. The other is an extension of themselves. Like, for example, other people are not going to be seen as fundamentally different. They're going to be seen as part of the self of the schizophrenic that's like a mirror. So no one is quite differentiated in Freud's view of schizophrenia, as if there was no alternative, no fundamental difference. In this way, it's a bit like what Lacan will expand after, in the idea that fundamentally there is no father figure or third party to fundamentally cut off the relationship between mother and son, and thus creates a world in which it's virtually objectless. But here they're not going to talk at all about Lacan. Lacan is not even mentioned. I assume because his theories were never necessarily had, until recently, had the exposure other ideas might have had. And of course, these ideas are mainly Anglo-Saxon, therefore you won't find any Recamier, any Lacan, any, who else? Pierre Marty, and so on and so forth. You're not going to find any of the French authors that theorized it because they're not necessarily involved in this. But nevertheless, it still remains a very good point. So moving on from Freud, we're going to go for Verdun. Verdun is another psychoanalyst. But contrary to Freud, he didn't feel that schizophrenia was due to too much narcissism or primary narcissism where everything was so focused on the self. But there was a lack of it, meaning the schizophrenic could not develop his core sense of self enough to be able to integrate other people. Meaning that instead of being just completely in of himself, there's not enough of himself, therefore there can't be a space created to integrate others and the images of others, the imagos of other people, which is a very interesting point of view. And I would say that it's completely worth mentioning that This point of view seems to me to be fundamentally interesting when we think about catatonia, i.e. people with psychosis that have completely withdrawn within themselves and have ceased to interact with the world. It seems to me that it's not because of a narcissism that's overwhelmingly there, but because there's not enough. So they have to withdraw in themselves to find it and to protect themselves and to protect that very isolated ego that's left. A bit like what Lane postulated when he talked about schizophrenic defenses and schizoid defenses. So they don't either talk about Lane, but moving on. So after that, we're gonna go through the ideas of, I'm taking the paper because fundamentally there's a lot of ideas. We're going to go through Margaret Meller. So for her, schizophrenia would be bounded by a form of interrelational disconnect, and that the fundamental needs of the child were not necessarily met, meaning that instead of being on rails, it's been derailed, as the authors point out very accurately. Then after, we're going to go through Harry Stark Sullivan's idea. Fundamentally, for Sullivan, the idea is that there is a relational problem, that every mode of being in humankind is bounded by adaptability, i.e. we all adapt to the world. The world does not necessarily adapt to us, but we do to it. And in this case scenarios, schizophrenics have had so much trauma that they are not able to adapt in a sufficiently good way-ish. It's not moral here, it's like to pass. The idea is they don't pass because they've been so traumatized that they can't adapt anymore. The whole point of Sullivan is to try and understand and be able to recreate a relationship that will then help them understand themselves and adapt to the world and to society. Here I'm just going to go for a little tangent, not too long, on the fact that I have never really read Harry Stark Sullivan, so I might be wrong or I might not understand the subtlety of the fairy, because that's not my school of thought. That doesn't mean it's not good, because when I was reading it, I found it fundamentally interesting and very, very rich in terms of thinking, but it's just I don't know about it, and perhaps I will know more at some point. But for now, when I'm doing this video, I'm not a Harry Stark Sullivan expert, so please feel free to drop any nuance if you know the model, because I clearly don't. But I found the introduction interesting, so even I benefited from these introductions. And after which we have the vision of Hartman, that basically expands the idea that because of that relational aspect, the ego must be in a way reinforced so that the id gets pushed back and that the ego can focus more on the pleasurable moments on the here and now. Then we have the whole point of view of Eric Fromm, and it's very interesting because he has the 8 basic needs. Again, I'm not a Frommian, I don't know if you can say that, but I'm not from Fromm schools. I don't really know too much about it, but I found it very interesting, especially the idea of relatedness, because I found it very, very true working with people with schizophrenia, that often there is a core element in their psyche which fears rejection and not being treated the same way as every other person. So that really talked to me as a clinician. Then we have transcendence, which is fundamentally interesting, where people need to create or destroy and have to feel the impact of their power. If we were to use Rollo May's version of it, that they need power on the world, both in creative aspects and destructive aspects. Then we get rootedness, the feeling that we need to belong somewhere, which is so very true with people with schizophrenia. They need to feel that they belong somewhere, as that non-belongingness can lead them to disinvest the world, both in a catatonic way, but also in terms of socially marginalizing themselves, becoming homeless, losing their jobs because there's no rootedness. Here, of course, I'm taking a tangent. The article is not saying that, but I'm integrating my thoughts within the article. Then we get basically the sense of identity, that we have to feel ourselves, and we have to be able to understand our productivity and our individuality. We have to also understand our frame of orientation and where we belong in the world. We need to be excited and be able to fundamentally seek goals and seek advancements, a unity between us and the world, and an effectiveness, the idea that we can accomplish things. So, as I stated, I am not an Eric Fromm scholar, so I don't really know, but it felt so interesting reading because it directly connected with my own clinical experience of people who have schizophrenia. So, fundamentally interesting. So, then we move on to the object relations score, which is my school of thought. And here we go with Melanie Klein. So a very good explanation of Melanie Klein and the fact that fundamentally at the very start of life, the infant has to split between good and bad because they can't integrate the whole of the badness, and the good within themselves cannot survive the badness of their psyche. So there's a fundamental cutoff point. And in this system, fundamentally, there's two positions for Klein: paranoid schizoid. I always get it wrong because in French, it's schizoparanoid, so they put the schizoid first. So I'm sorry, I'm always going to make that mistake. But there we go. So we have the paranoid schizoid position, which is basically a fear that since all the bad will contaminate the good, that the bad is all powerful, but also that oneself is all powerful. So it's like a clash of gods in a way, that the infant feels all powerful, all connected, that he is the mother is him, that he's the breast, the breast is him. And he's very afraid because then there is the bad breast that might destroy him. And remember, because we are in fantasies of all powerfulness, well, there's a real risk and a real threat to that bad breast destroying the infant. And after which, once the paranoid schizoid, I told you I'd make the mistake, once that goes through, there's the depressive position, which for Melanie Klein is the pinnacle of human development, because fundamentally at that moment we can integrate grief, we can integrate loss, we can integrate a real relationship with others, both in the good and the bad. We no longer need a splitting off of both. We can just take in good and bad both for ourselves and for others, which is fundamental in our psychic construction. And it's a very good and a very short but a very good introduction to Melanie Klein's major theories. So after which we have someone I was very, very surprised to read in this article, William Fernburn. So I'm happy to see him quoted everywhere because I personally love his theories. But why I was so surprised is that having read his articles and his texts, he's quite adamant that his model does not work for schizophrenia. So I was very surprised to see him here. But I'm also very glad because I myself have been thinking of how to apply his model of the endopsychic structure, which I already talked about at length in this on this channel, which you can go and see in all my Fernburn videos. And I've been toying myself with the idea of how to adapt it to help my psychotic patients and my schizophrenic patients. And I do believe, I haven't found it at time of recording, but I do believe that there is a way of doing it. And it needs more thought on my behalf, and it needs more construction. But I'm really sure there's a way of doing it. So I was very happy to see his theories, because I do think that they can be adapted. Even though in this article they don't necessarily adapt it, they just present what he felt. I do think that there is a high potential for help in his model. So then we move on to Winnicott with the good enough mother, and that idea that fundamentally the baby needs someone that's going to adapt to him or her, and it's going to help them through the process of acquiring frustration and be able to tolerate it, which is a very, very important phase for the infant and for the individual. Then we have Edith Jacobson that basically felt that there was a problem of identity and self-esteem in psychosis, which is completely true, because once the delusions have passed, well, the psychotic individual feels empty, feels sometimes even worthless because they can't work, they can't do this, they can't do that, and there is very often a comparison with normality. So, right on point. And she apparently developed treatments for people who had pre-Oedipal dispositions. Very interesting. Then, fundamentally, we have the idea, then we're moving on from object relations to the family transactional model, which is the double bind theory, i.e. it's a very famous theory of there is something in the communication of the family itself which is so contradictory that the individual cannot quite be able to answer it without failing it. So a very, very stupid but I think to the point example would be to say that a double bind is as if I was telling you right now, don't listen to me, right? Whatever you do right now, don't listen to me. So here you see that there is something completely fundamentally contradictory with me saying something that you can only listen to or see if you were, but anyway, or deaf, or right? But if you, in case, and I'm going to go for the a priori that you're not, you can't obey me if I'm telling you not to obey me and telling you to obey me at the same time. So there's a fundamental core paradox that's so unthinkable that can, with people that are fragile, trigger a psychotic moment and there has been studies that were done to see that families in which double bind was the main mode of communication could impact the infant and in cases create schizophrenic symptoms because the child cannot answer correctly. The child is lost within communication itself, which if the child is, then the sense of identity becomes impacted and hurt. So all of these theories are very interesting and they have created the whole model of family therapy, which is a very important and interesting model, even if it's, again, not mine, so to speak. So fundamentally, what I loved is that at the end of this article is the goals of psychotherapy in schizophrenia. So schizophrenia is a notoriously hard illness, and it's often considered one of the most difficult to treat by mental health professionals. And in my experience, it's very true, as you can't aim for something like a cure or like the disappearance of symptoms. But what you can aim at, and what this article very, very interestingly points out, is that you can aim for the schizophrenic patient to be able to express their emotions, to be able to have a space in which they can talk about how paradoxical their experience of life can get and how fundamentally different their experience in the world. So it might not seem like much, but it's so important because often they can't have those conversations because people are afraid of the psychotic elements. They're afraid that they will be hurt or that they might be so unpredictable that they will do something harmful, but they don't. But they need that space, and this work with the psychologist can fundamentally help them being able to express that idiosyncrasy that they are experiencing. And fundamentally, they can find meaning and they can understand their past and sometimes let go. So there's a lot of things to do in psychodynamic therapy, and I was so happy to see it in the article because it's true that very often, especially nowadays, there is this modern vision that schizophrenia is merely a biological illness, that it's neurological and that nothing really helps except medication. And that's something that I've never agreed with. Not that medication can't help, because I think medication can absolutely help those people. But I also think that therapy can be fundamentally important and very, very meaningful for those people, as it can give them the space to exist in without being afraid, and to also be able to connect to the therapist and create a new sense of meaning and relational stability in which you you could not have with other people because of the effect of fear of that strange quote-unquote subjectivity, which is not the case with the therapist, because the therapist knows that what are the symptoms and they can just accept them and to welcome them within their psyche without being afraid. I was talking a week ago about projective identification, positive projective identification, and I think it can work in these cases. But here I'm straying quite a lot from the article. And the article ends on something that I found wonderful. It ends on meta-analyses. So I'm not too much into the meta-analyses, the studies, because I always feel that there's something lacking in them. But here I really liked it because fundamentally there was meta-analyses of psychodynamic and psychoanalytic approaches to patients with schizophrenia and other forms of mental illnesses. And it fundamentally points out that 92% of the patients have experienced a betterment through treatment. And I was so happy to see that figure because it shows that even though it is one of the perhaps more complicated, more nuanced and more difficult types of psychopathologies to deal with, there is hope, and that there is a way of doing it, that in a way it's not just the medication that can help. Psychotherapy is also very important. And I was very happy to see that our methods could work, because that's always something that was put into question, at least since I've been training. It's always been a question of, can you really help people with schizophrenia? And the answer is yes. And that's a great answer. I love it. And I felt that, of course, the article ends with the limitations, but so does all articles of that nature. And it's a fair sin that we need more studies, but it's nevertheless joyful that 92% of the people were helped. I mean, still wonderful. So this is pretty much ends it. So I just wanted to say that I really liked the article. I really found that it made justice to Anglo-Saxon thinking and Anglo-Saxon's point of view on the theories of schizophrenia. And there's nothing that I really feel needs to be added, if not a bit of Lacan, because a big part of his theory is orientated towards psychosis. So it would have been interesting. But that's, I think, nitpicking. And I felt that the article was quite a good read. And I encourage you to read it if you're interested. So if you have any questions, any details, anything you want to put in the comments, feel free to do so. And I'll see you in the next one. Bye.